Hey, my name's Matt Kennedy, and this is the Steadfast Podcast. This podcast exists to use Bible study and theological teaching to encourage you to be steadfast in your faith. Thank you for taking time out of your day to check out the Steadfast Podcast. I hope today's episode is an encouragement to you.
Not counting the resurrection, there is one miracle that Jesus performs that appears in all four gospel accounts. It shows up in Matthew, and Mark, and Luke, and John, and that is the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus took a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish and fed 5,000 people. And it is no really surprise that that's the one that's recorded for all of them to talk about, because of the magnitude and how big it was, how many people were present. And honestly, there's probably far more people present at that event than maybe we think about. Because when Matthew is writing the event, in Matthew chapter 14, he says in verse 21, "And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." So in that 5,000 number, it's not even talking about women and children who are present. Different scholars will say maybe 10,000 people total, maybe 15,000. I know Pastor John MacArthur estimates it could be 20,000 or even 25,000 people present at that event. So for these disciples, that's probably the largest gathering of people they have seen in their entire life. And so it's no wonder that everyone takes note and everyone writes it down. But this event has a little brother, one that's like it, but maybe a little bit smaller scale, that we kind of gloss over a little bit, and some people might even think it's a typo. That when it says Jesus fed 4,000, well, that they meant 5,000. But truth be told, at this point in the book of Mark, the feeding of the 5,000 has already happened. This is a brand new event that is smaller, but has so much significance to it. Now, when we talk about reading our Bibles in youth, there's three questions that I have said an annoying amount of times. And those three questions are meant to point to a greater understanding of what we're reading. So we don't just read to check it off our to-do list and say, hey, I read my Bible, I'm a good Christian. But we're reading for life transformation. We want to absorb what the text is giving us. We want to be formed by the Holy Spirit through the reading of the Word of God. And those three questions are, what is happening in this text? In other words, what's the big event? What's the main idea? The second question is, what does this teach me about God? In other words, what is God like? What is He doing? What does He care about? How does He relate to us? And the third question is, what does this teach me about following Jesus? Is there a command to obey? Is there a sin to avoid? An example to follow? A promise to claim in my life? What does this teach me about following Jesus? And truth be told, I think if we answer those three questions really well, that's a lot of what sermons are, right? We explain the text, we point to what it tells us about God, and then apply it to our life. In this passage we're going to read in just a moment, there's going to be three major things the disciples were supposed to learn about who God is. It's already been revealed to them before, but this is another opportunity for them to learn three important things about who God is, and specifically God in the flesh, Jesus Christ. All right. So, the feeding of the 4,000. Let's get into Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 1. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, He, Jesus, called His disciples to Him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. We're going to stop here because we've already seen the first truth this teaches us about who God is, specifically about who Jesus is, God in the flesh. And that is, Jesus has compassion for our needs. See, it wasn't the disciples who brought up the problem of all these hungry people. It was Jesus who observed it, Jesus who knew it, and Jesus who wanted to take action because of it. So, we're going to read later on in the passage that there's going to be 4,000 people gathered. That's 4,000 total. This is not 4,000 men besides women and children. This is 4,000 total. And this huge crowd of people have been with Jesus for 3 days, presumably listening to Him preach. I know that you have thought our sermons have been long here, but not one of them have lasted 3 days. It may have felt that way, but it has not in reality lasted 3 days. In this time, Jesus sees this need among the crowd, this huge need, that they needed food, that they needed to eat, that they were growing weak, that it would have been dangerous for them to travel very far in the heat of the day to find food on their own. And besides, there's 4,000 of them gathered together. I'm going to guess there's not many marketplaces around that have the capacity to host 4,000 people at random. They had a real material need. And I think it's noteworthy to say that Jesus doesn't look at this crowd and say like, well, too bad, guys. You should have planned better. Maybe next time pack a lunch or 3 lunches. No, he has compassion for them and wants to seek to create a plan for them. He sees the need, he knows the need, and has compassion for the need. And I know for some who are here, or maybe some who are online, sometimes we can forget about that he has compassion for us. Because sometimes there can be moments in our days, in our weeks, in our months, in our life where God feels distant. Where it seems like, well, maybe he's turned his face from me. Maybe like my prayers are getting stuck on the ceiling. Maybe he's forgotten about what's going on in my life. Maybe he's forgotten about the needs that I have. And the thing is, when that happens, what we can do, and we all can do it, is we can let the situation that we're going through tell us about who our God is, instead of rooting who we know our God to be in his word. You see, we have to be very careful when things are difficult. When problems come up that we don't see a good outcome for, we have to be very careful we're not getting our theology from our problems. We have to be very careful that we are not informing what we believe about God to be true by what's happening to us. Because the thing about that is what's happening to us, we have this way of tilting the scales. And we can tilt the scales in a way where we have the worst that's ever had it. That God is blessing everyone else, but he's not blessing us, that he's forgotten about us, that we're just wandering in the wilderness, and where is God? You see, we have an enemy who wants to slide those little thoughts right into our head. It's like, oh, that didn't go your way. That thing you've been praying for didn't happen. Are you sure God's still there? Are you sure that God is still for you? Did God actually say that you are his child? Did God actually say that he did love you? And when I say these questions out loud, surely all of us are like, yeah, that's crazy. Of course I know God loves me, for God so loved the world. Of course I know God loves me. But God proved his own love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for me. Of course I know that. But if I let my situation and my needs and my problem inform me on who God is, I'm going to get further and further about what his word reveals to be true. And his word reveals that he has compassion on us, that he cares for us, that he is near to us, that he has not forgotten us. He is not able to forget you. He is compassionate. For those who are in Christ, we have the wonderful assurance that he will never leave us, he will never forsake us, that he will always be right there with us. Look, in Psalm 23, we get 2 vantage points. You can be by still waters, just chilling, just relaxing, just having yourself a great time. Or you can be going through the valley of the shadow of death. But what do we know about the Good Shepherd? He's there in both places. He's just as near in the valley of the shadow of death as he is by still waters. He is just as compassionate in the valley of the shadow of death as he is by still waters. He is the same God, because as Hebrews tells us, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He does not change. His compassion does not change. His nearness does not change. You can ignore him, but that doesn't mean he's not near. The same Jesus sees us, is near to us, and has compassion for us. Doesn't the author of Hebrews tell us that in times of need, we should draw near to the throne of grace with confidence to find the mercy, to find the grace we need? Of course, that's what God's word says. And this is why it is so important for us to root our theology, to root what we believe about God in his word and not in the storms of life. You'll have much, much better theology if you get who God is and what God is like from the Word that He has preserved and created for you. But we have to know it. And I know there may be some thinking compassion is great, but in this moment of my life, I need more than compassion. I need action, right? I need a provision for this thing, because compassion didn't fill their bellies, right? There had to be something that went beyond the compassion. And we're going to see that starting again in verse 4. And his disciples answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" And he, Jesus, asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. So we've seen that Jesus has compassion for our needs, and now we see Jesus has provision for our needs. One thing I think that is interesting about this whole event is that the disciples are like, how in the world are we going to get this bread? We're in a desolate place. Where are you going to find bread to feed all of these people when they have already witnessed Jesus taking bread and fish to feed a much larger crowd? And it's not that they forgot that that event happened. We're going to see later on in the passage that they remember details about that. But for whatever reason, they're not applying that previous moment to their current problem, which is something I think we all can struggle with doing. Jesus asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" Which is word for word what he said in the previous passage. He takes the 7 loaves and the few fish and multiplied them and gave them to the people. Not only did he have compassion for their need, he provided for their need. He had provision for their need. He had exactly what they needed. They were hungry, and he gave them food. Let us not forget that when we talk about our God, we are talking about the King of the universe. We are talking about the one who has no shortage of resources. He has an infinite amount of resources. If he were to pour it out every single day, it would never grow empty. We are calling about the one who doesn't need to let me see if I can make some phone calls, move some things around, and then we'll see if we can help. He has it at the ready. What we need, he can always provide. And you know what's also just so amazing for us to understand? He doesn't begrudge this. He actually delights to give good gifts to his children. He actually enjoys blessing us. He actually enjoys bringing blessing to his people. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 10 and 11, Jesus says this. He's talking about human fathers and their relationship to human kids and comparing that to the heavenly Father. He said, "Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent?" That would be a really mean trick, right? Have like a little basket that's covered, like, here's your fish, open it up and a serpent pop out. No. "If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" God gives good gifts. He is a blesser, and he enjoys being a blesser. He enjoys being a father that gives something to his children that they delight in, that they enjoy. This is part of the heart of God. There should be no mystery that the Bible calls God our Father time and time again. He wants to bless his children. I think some question God's provision. Some people question God's provision, God's ability to provide for their problem, because they have a little bit of spiritual amnesia. They have a little bit of an issue remembering the good gifts God has poured into their life time and time again. They forget of all the ways that God has come through for them in the past, how God has blessed them in the past. And what's a little bit wild is that for those of us, we live in a time and a place that make us among the most privileged people to ever walk the face of the earth. And yet we spend half our breath complaining, right? We are among the most privileged. There have been few people in the history of mankind that have enjoyed security like we are in this moment. There have been few people in the history of mankind that have enjoyed food security like we are in this moment. We could go down the list. We are among the most privileged people. And yet we forget so much of that because there's something that we wanted God to do in a certain way at a certain time, and He didn't do it our way. And then we immediately say, God, where are you? Why don't you do anything for me? Why don't you bless me like you bless these other people? And I say this as lovingly as I can. I think a lot of us are spiritually spoiled. Like we can look and we can say like, oh, so-and-so, they just gets everything they've ever wanted. Oh, my goodness, if previous generations could see us, they would be like, well, what in the world do they have to complain about? The blessings that have been given and poured out on them I can't even count. It would be a good exercise for all of us this afternoon, like when you get home, to just start counting out your blessings, counting out the goodness of God in your life. Your family, your friends, the home you live in, the air condition, the access to food and clean water, the clean clothes, the multiple sets of clothes, and on it goes. We are a privileged people. Let us not doubt God's provision in our life because He doesn't do everything we want Him to. And if we're really honest here, if God had done everything I've asked Him to, if God had said yes to all of my prayers, it would be an absolutely, maybe the most epic dumpster fire that has ever happened in the history of the earth. Because there's moments I think I'm a pretty smart guy. But if I'm comparing myself to the perspective and the knowledge and the wisdom of the Most High God, it doesn't get dumber than this, okay? I don't know what's for my best. I don't know what's for my good like my God knows what's for my good. And furthermore, pushing it outside of myself, I don't know what's for the good of any of y'all. I don't know what the best thing is in all of your situations. But I know that there is a God that does. And that when He says no, there's a reason behind it. When He says not yet, there's a reason behind it. When He says yes, but not like you think, there is a reason behind it. And there's a reason behind the yeses too. And the way that He provides, it is a call for us to trust Him, that the one opening His hand of provision is the one who knows what He's doing. And that I may not understand it, I may not always like it, but I need to trust it. And I know, I don't mean to downplay unanswered prayers, because every single person in this room has had a moment that is marred by pain, that is maybe soaked by tears, of not understanding why God allowed something, of not understanding why God didn't do something differently. And not all of those things have to do with us being ungrateful. Some of those things have real heart connections and are just painful and are marred with mystery. And I can't give you the answer beyond I know that the God we serve and the God we worship is good. And I know that He knows what He's doing more than I ever could. And I know that because He has proven His own love for me, that though I may not understand much of anything, I can understand that I can trust Him, even if it's soaked with tears. I can trust Him because He is trustworthy. In this passage, Jesus knows, I need to speed up. Jesus knows I need to speed up. In this passage, Jesus knows the need is food, and He instantly provides food for the masses. And oftentimes, a million times more, He gives us exactly the material thing that we needed for that situation. And praise God for His provision. But I think sometimes, if there is purpose in the problem, it is to point us back to our Creator. Sometimes the need that is there is meant to reveal to you that you are seeking provision in a place that you were not meant to seek it. You are trusting things to bring fulfillment that were not meant to be fulfilled by. And then we're wondering, why do I feel so anxious? Why do I feel so broken by trusting something to fulfill me that wasn't meant to fulfill me? We just sang a song about how He is better than life. How there are so many things in life that we look to cling to be the missing piece that satisfies our soul, and those things don't ever work. But the good news, Jesus has compassion for our needs. Jesus has provision for our needs, And in these next few verses, we're going to see that provision goes a step further. Verse 8, and they ate, the crowd ate, and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. And the last point in this miracle is that Jesus has satisfaction for our needs. He doesn't just give the bare minimum. He doesn't just give something that pacifies. He gives something that's going to satisfy. See, he is the one who we are made for. And until we understand that, we will never find the satisfaction our very soul needs. This huge crowd didn't just have an appetizer of bread. They had enough to fill them and to satisfy them. Even though their hunger was surely strong because they've been there for 3 days, the provision that Jesus offered them was strong enough to fully satisfy. So much that they had leftovers. Now, it says in verse 8 that they had 7 baskets full of leftovers. And that sounds like a lot of leftovers. But what I want to tell you is that it's actually more leftover than you might think. You see, there's 2 words in the New Testament that's used to describe a basket. There's a standard little basket that you would maybe take a meal off of. But then there's a different kind of basket called spouris. That's the Greek word, spouris. And it appears very limitedly in the New Testament. See, Matthew and Mark both describe this event. Both use the word spouris, large, very large basket, to describe the leftovers. There's only one other place other than this event, as recorded in Matthew and Mark, that it appears. You might remember in Acts chapter 9, Paul he's going, he meets Jesus, he sees the light quite literally, and he starts telling people about Jesus. He becomes an evangelist right off the bat. He wants to tell people about Jesus. And that makes some people very upset. So upset that people want to get Paul out of the picture like that. So do you remember what the Christians of the city did? To help Paul escape from this, they lower him down at night on the city wall. They lower him down in a basket. Spouris. The same type of basket in this passage. I don't know how big of a man Paul was, but I know to hold a man, a basket's got to be pretty substantial. He could have been a wee little man for all I know, but even a wee little man's going to need a good-sized basket to be able to hold his weight going down the wall. So when Jesus says the Bible says there are 7 baskets left over, there are 7 kind of man-sized baskets left over to show Jesus did not meet the bare minimum. He went above and beyond so that these things may have been difficult to carry and maneuver around. He had a lot of provision to satisfy them. So whether the provision he gives us is to meet a material or situational need that points us to him, or if he reveals more of himself to us in the midst of our disappointment, satisfaction is only going to be found in him. He is enough. And what this passage really tells us is that he is more than enough. Our cup runs over. Our man-sized baskets are completely full with the leftover of the provision that he gives. He's not a bare minimum kind of God. He is the one to satisfy your soul. The only one to satisfy your soul as you wander through this life looking and clinging to things to bring some spark of joy or fulfillment. He says loudly here, it is only going to be found in him. He is the source of our soul satisfaction. And I think for some of us, we need to hear this because we are spending all of our time and our energy and our resources trying to cling on to other stuff. If we could just have more money, if we could just have a better job, if we could just upgrade family, if we could just do whatever it is, that somehow it would be better. We could be fulfilled, we could be satisfied. The truth of it is that our Creator God made us in a way where we are needy of him. And without him, we will never find the satisfaction. That's not him being selfish. He understands what the greatest good is in this universe, and that is him. It is generous of him to make this whole thing called life in a way that we are required to be drawn to Him to find our deepest satisfaction. Because He's the greatest good. If we were drawn to anything else to find our deepest satisfaction, then that would only lead to heartbreak and devastation. Our God is compassionate, He has provision, and He is the source of satisfaction. Now, this is the big event that we were talking about. The rest of our time is going to be spent on two conversations that happen after this that really reveal a lot to us, I think a lot to us, about how we see life and how we are in this life. Okay? I think when yes, we have time. Okay, I'm going to say we have time. When we read our Bible, sometimes what happens is we have those little headings to sections, and those headings sometimes tell us to stop, right? Like we're moving to something totally different. Mark didn't write the headings in your Bible. He wrote what's the content of the verses, but he didn't put numbers on verses and chapters. He didn't put those headings. He didn't intend people to stop there. And sometimes those headings block us from gaining a fuller meaning of what's happening in a passage because we think, okay, I've covered that event, now I'm good to go. Because the two things that happen afterwards are directly connected to that event. Okay, now, we're going to pick back up in verse 11. Remember, they just got on a boat and went to the district of Dalmanutha. And apparently, it wasn't long until they had company. Starting in verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So the Pharisees come, and they're not happy, which is par for the course, right? They come and they're upset about what they're hearing about Jesus, and they demand that he do some kind of special thing right in front of them. But you see, for the Pharisees, it really wasn't a matter of evidence. It was a matter of hardness of heart. You see, their struggle is they just could not believe Jesus is who he said he was. They could not believe the testimony of other people about Jesus. They just could not believe. And so in this moment, Jesus and the disciples get right back into the boat and go to the other side. Now, before I read this last conversation that happens, or last two parts of a conversation that happens, I want you to remember, because we got to keep this big picture or we lose stuff here. First, Jesus saw the need for the 4,000, and he fed them with 7 loaves, okay? He had just performed a miracle, got on the boat, went to the other side, and they're like, we want to see a miracle. They just missed it. And then they had this conversation. They're mad, they're upset because they couldn't believe Jesus is the Messiah. Now, verse 14. Let's talk about the disciples. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he, Jesus, cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. Now, I want you to think about what's happening here. They get in the boat after this conversation with the Pharisees. So Jesus leans in, and he's like, hey, watch out for those guys. They struggle with unbelief. And the thing about unbelief, it is contagious. That's why they talk about the leaven of the Pharisees, because it's something that can spread quickly. It's something that is contagious. Fear is something that rubs off on other people awfully quickly. Unbelief spreads fast. So Jesus takes this moment as a teaching point. But do you see what the disciples are doing? I mean, as soon as they're in the boat, they're like, we only got 1 loaf of bread. There's 13 of us. This is truly an insurmountable problem. This may be the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. Jesus says, hey, watch out for those who do not believe. It may spread. Your faith may diminish. That's great, Jesus. Hey, guys, we don't have bread. Do you see a little bit of humor in this? They just witnessed Jesus take 7 loaves and feed 4,000 people. Now they're in a boat with 1 loaf, 12 disciples, 1 Jesus. This is too big of a problem. This is probably how we die. It's all over now. We had a good run. You know, Jesus fed other people. He healed the sick, cast out demons. But we are hungry. Now we look at this and it's silly, right? Because they're like, have you forgotten who's in the boat? Have you forgotten that the one who had compassion on the crowd, who had provision for the crowd and left the crowd fully satisfied, have you forgotten he is right there with you? But we do this thing. We can know the stuff, right? We can know all the answers. A lot of you have been in this church or a church most of, if not your whole life. If we were to Bible quiz you, you would ace it, knowing the stuff. But sometimes it's not really that we don't know it, it's that we fail to apply it to our situation at hand. I mean, these guys were less than 24 hours, most likely, from witnessing this mind-boggling miracle after they'd already seen him feed a bigger crowd. And yet this was too big of an obstacle in their brains. See, their eyes went off of their Jesus and went on to their problem. They had a little bit of amnesia. And when it says that they began discussing with one another the fact they had no bread, what I hear is they started blaming each other for not bringing bread. Peter, wasn't that your job? No, John, that was James's job. You know what I mean? Like tossing around the blame. Still not realizing who's in the boat. So verse 17, the final part of our passage. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. They remembered. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said, "Do you not yet understand?" All they needed was in the boat. They were not lacking anything because they had Jesus in the boat. It really didn't matter if they had that loaf or not. They had Jesus in the boat. The one who had compassion, the one who had provision, and the one who brought satisfaction was right there with them. Jesus is asking a series of questions that show us they had the knowledge they needed. But what it also shows us is that knowledge was up here and was not being applied to their hearts to be able to navigate the situation at hand. I think there is a huge gap between knowing something is true and trusting that it is true. There is a huge gap in having the head knowledge of something, but not applying it to our life, not letting it change the way we live. You see, if we believe that our God is the creator and sustainer of the heavens and the earth, if we believe that our God is the Savior and Redeemer of all who are called by His name, then should that not affect how we go about our lives, how we see the problems in our lives? Because we are not like this boat way out in the sea, flopping around in the waves and the wind. We are one who is with Jesus. And we should know the sky is not falling because it's our Jesus who's holding it up. The way we see our problems and our storms and our obstacles has to be different because we got Jesus in the boat. And He has promised that He's not going to jump out of the boat. He's going to stay right there with us. Regardless if we had that loaf or not, Jesus is in the boat. When I was in college and then in seminary, my favorite places to do schoolwork would be in coffee shops. And now around colleges, coffee shops are loud. They're like buzzing with people. And there's tons of conversations going on. And some might say, like, well, that doesn't sound like the wisest place to write papers or to read or whatever. But one thing the Lord has gifted me with is a innate ability to tune out things. And I can hear the sounds that are around me, but it's like they're somewhere else. I can hear, but not listen. And this is not the time to point the finger at anyone else in your life who you feel like hears but does not listen. Because we all recognize there is a difference in hearing a sound and listening to what that sound is saying. The way our office is, and my office is right at the top of the stairs, if I wanted to listen, I could hear all the conversations that happen downstairs because of how the sound travels. I don't want to listen, so it just tunes that out. I just tune that out. That's all well and good when you're in office, when you're at a coffee shop trying to be productive. But the thing that we're all gifted in is tuning out the knowledge we have about God. It's not that we forget, because if I were to ask y'all to like popcorn answers for me, like what is God like, you'd probably be able to come up with a lot of things that played on the bumper video. You know, God is holy, God is powerful, God is compassionate, God is wise, God is this, God is that. You could say those things. But are you letting your heart marinate with the truth of who God is so that when storms come up, you're like, hey, I see that storm. Sure, it's scary, but I got Jesus in the boat. And if I have Jesus in the boat, I don't know where that storm's going to take me, but I know that Jesus is going to be with me wherever I go. I know that He's not going to leave me or forsake me. I know that He loved me enough to go to the cross for me, to die in my place. I know that I have Jesus in the boat. And if I have Jesus in the boat, then what shall I fear? If I have Jesus in the boat, what obstacle is too big? If I have Jesus in the boat, then why is my list of gratitude not longer? We have Jesus in the boat. I know for so many of us, we are like the disciples were, problem-focused. You might be problem-focused in how you zero in on how overwhelming something is. You might be problem-focused in how you zero in on whose fault it might be, like I think the disciples probably were. Or you might be problem-focused and you zero in on as soon as something comes up, you're like, all right, what's our game plan? What's our strategy? We're going to take the hill. What do we need to do? And as I say those things, being overwhelmed, blaming others, writing up a battle plan, a lot of you are going to hear option C is the right way to go. And option C has its place. C is always the right answer, right? But there's something all those things are forgetting. There's something all those things are leaving out. Is that we're not called to be focused on the problem. Because the solution is not going to be found by the works of my hands or the words of my mouth. For us, followers of Christ, the solution is not what we have with us, but who we have with us. And we need to do a better job of calling out, bringing these things to our God and trusting Him. I'm not saying don't do anything, but I'm saying make sure He's in on the front end and not as the last resort. Let's make sure we're bringing the problems to Him first and not, well, I tried all this stuff and it didn't work, so I guess I should pray now, right? Bring it to the Lord. When we see this, we see the absurdity of the disciples' focus on the problem in the boat, of not having enough bread when Jesus just fed the 4,000. But it is just as absurd for us as followers of Jesus Christ to focus on our problem when Jesus has already defeated sin and death on our behalf. When He has already done far greater things than feeding 4,000 people on our behalf. My main charge here today, do you just remember who's in the boat? In Mark 9, there's a man who brings his son to Jesus. The boy has been afflicted with an unclean spirit and has done just horrible things to the boy. This father goes to Jesus and he says, if you can do anything, help him. To which Jesus responds, if you can? And his father says, I believe. Help my unbelief. Man, I think those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words are about as relatable as we're going to find. When we're in this boat with Jesus in the boat with us, we may have all the facts. We may say we believe everything that video played a few minutes ago. We may say we believe every word of Scripture. But are we believing it enough to understand that Jesus is right there, arm around us in the storm that we are fighting? You see, I think some people today, the work you need to do with the Lord is to say what that father said. Jesus, I believe. Help my unbelief. And so as I draw us to a close now, I want to say, don't let the problem you have, and I know it might be significant, I'm really trying not to downplay any of it by poking fun at the disciples here. I no doubt that you have some need that is significant and great and weighty. But no matter what that is, no matter how heavy it is, do not let it make you miss your need for Jesus. I assure you, He is just as real in this moment, having compassion, having provision, having satisfaction, as He was in Mark chapter 8. He is just as real, just as present, just as powerful, just as near.
Thanks for listening to the Steadfast Podcast. I want to remind you that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, Paul wrote this, quote, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." End quote. So in light of biblical truth, let us be steadfast, immovable. Let us remember that through Jesus, not one labor is in vain, not one trial is in vain, not one effort in all of our lives is in vain. Because He gives purpose, and that purpose rings through eternity. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget, if you've got questions you would like answered, you can email me at matt@steadfastpodcast.com.